I thought I'd start this being the centenary this week of the start of World War I with a German military theorist. In fact, a German military theorist who probably more than any single person affected the type of war that World War I was, von Clausewitz. And I keep a quote of von Clausewitz very close because he said, "Beware the vividness of the transient moment." And if I could have taken my young self aside back when I joined the public service in the early 1980s and said, whenever you're involved in reform, beware the vividness of the transient moment, that might have served me very well. Because one of my key reflections on all the reform that I've either been a very small part of or been implicated in, there are those moments when it is all in glorious technicolor about to go horribly, horribly wrong, and if you hold your nerve, you pull through and you drive reform. Why would we even care about reform? Well, my clever staff sitting down here very helpfully in my notes reminded me that when I joined the public service, Western Australia still had capital punishment, progressive state, not like Victoria. We still had typists. And we were only just digesting then the Royal Commission on Australian Government Administration that had been started under Gough Whitlam. So I reflect back then and look now at the kind of public services that we have across the nation, and there has been a tremendous body of reform to the actual stuff of what public administration is. And as Dame Jenny, I think, very eloquently put it, any reform worth doing has to be enduring. So I've reflected a lot on all the reform that I've been a part of and set myself the task of saying, well, was it enduring? And I think the answer is some. And my reflections on how do you get to enduring change, the sort of enduring change that does lead to confrontational, very vivid moments for the public servants and the politicians that drive those reforms. My reflections are, one, timing is everything. A moment arrives and you've really got to have the ideas ready to seize that moment. It might be a moment, if you think back in recent history, to do with terrorism. Maybe a moment to do with health reform. It may be a moment to do with immigration reform. You can't always predict when the moment arrives. Sometimes you can work with politicians and you can work with various organisations, the Productivity Commission, Gary's old stomping ground, to create a moment, but generally speaking you can't predict when the moment's going to arrive. But when it does arrive, you've really got to be ready, because our job is about reform. That's actually why we're here. The public has the right to assume away that we're going to administer things well. But beyond administering things well, our higher purpose is to make things better. And you don't make things better by leaving them the way they are. Have to drive to reform. And sometimes the timing presents itself, and if you're sitting there and you don't have ideas, you don't have something in the bottom drawer, you haven't given thought to what comes next, probably letting the public down. And I'd have to confess some moments have arrived and I probably wasn't as ready as I should have been. In terms of timing being everything, I think context, something else Dame Jenny talked about, this notion of context. What context are we in? We don't, I think, as senior public servants, probably spend enough time with our staff explaining the context in which they are working. People take better decisions, they're more likely to engage with reform if we provide context. And the context right now, it is tough, it is complicated, and we need to go back to some basics in public administration. Things need to be run well before we get to reform in some areas, certainly in state government. We do sometimes, in context, in thinking about timing being everything, we do as public servants tend to want to commentate rather than engage with reform. We tend to be very skilled at describing the problem for our political leaders, possibly less skilled in actually offering them up solutions or directions. If you stand back and take any department anywhere in the country and look at the body of its advice to a minister or a premier or a prime minister, you will tend to find that we're very good at commentating, not so good at the directional stuff. The other reflection I'd have is I wish somebody had told me it's okay to be direct. It is okay to be direct with colleagues. It is okay to be direct with stakeholders. It's not appropriate to bully them or to be rude to them or anything like that, but it's okay to be direct. We're going to have over the next decade a few more direct conversations as a community because we can no longer afford many of the things that we thought we were going to aspire to in the next decade. So we're going to have to unwind some big slabs of public policy, and that's not going to be a pleasant process. Another reflection on reform, it's a virtuous cycle. One reform is built on another reform. I saw Andrew Podger earlier, who was my secretary in the Federal Health Department way back in the 90s when we introduced primary health care items. Now that in itself took 10 years to get the notion that maybe we would give general practitioners money that might involve them working with allied health professionals to provide packages of care to people with chronic conditions or older people. Now, it would be absolute heresy to say, well, let's withdraw those Medicare items as a savings measure. At the time, it was revolutionary. And now people are starting to play with those concepts and take them to the next level. And what they're able to do is learn from the experience in the virtuous cycle of reform. One reform leads to another reform. And if you do the reform properly and lay the foundations to collect evidence and evaluate and basically create the virtuous cycle, you lead to further reform. So again, what I would have said to my younger self was, be in the moment, but don't be so in the moment that you forget that what you're laying down is somebody else's working environment in a decade or 20 years' time. So be very careful at what you're doing now. You're providing hooks for them in the future for the next round of reform. The other thing I think, and this is a reflection looking back at Canberra after 25 years here, Canberra has a lot to recommend it, but partnership and consultation are not things that one associates with Canberra if you work in state government. And if I was talking to my young self about to embark on a career in Canberra, I would have said, be more humble, shut up and listen, get out on the ground and talk to people and work in partnership with them. There is too much a tendency in Canberra to want to dictate terms to people. Too much we've had a good idea sitting here round the lake and not enough we think we've got a good idea but we'd like to come and talk to you about it. Now it's getting better in patches, but there's still this tendency to say we've had a bright idea. Knowing what I know now, working in state government and reflecting on the way I behaved on the way through, I didn't exhibit some of the values that you would hope that senior public servants would exhibit. And I think everybody in state government in the room would kind of acknowledge the experience of being confronted by somebody from Canberra with a good idea. And it may be a good idea, but at least pay people the courtesy of talking to them about it and engaging with them. So that process of creating genuine collaborative relationships. Collaboration doesn't mean we all have to agree, doesn't mean that at all, but it does mean we agree that we're going to work together to chase an idea down and to sort it all the way through so that a government might have some really enduring policy options. I think we could do with a fair bit more of that in public administration. And for reasons of where we are in the economic cycles, the next big challenges facing Australia largely lie with state governments. They are in infrastructure, they are in education and healthcare. So for the next 10 years, one would expect that we'll see a lot of collaboration with state government because those are the big areas that are going to affect our ability as a nation to compete and to deal with ageing and a range of other issues. A key learning I'd reflect on is reform isn't an end in itself. You'll often hear political leaders say, well, we've got to reform. Yes, we do need to reform, but we don't have to reform mindlessly and endlessly. There is a time for reform, and there is a time to shape and frame reform, but not endlessly and meaninglessly. And so one of the traps I think that we've fallen into, because we had lots of money over the last halcyon decade, we tended to think that every problem required a new program. We basically were the tradesperson with a hammer, and every problem presented as looking like a nail that needed hitting in. We had money, and so every problem presented itself as a new program. A lot of evidence to suggest that we've wasted a lot of money. We didn't buy what we might have expected to buy on behalf of the taxpayer. Circumstances have changed, and we're going to be asked some harder questions. So reform isn't an end in itself. I come back to the notion of enduring change. This notion that real reform, how do you know something's a real reform? How do you know something's really been done well, that you can look up to the public servants and the politicians that delivered that thing? Is it enduring? Has it endured political cycles? Has it endured economic cycles? Has it endured trial by media or trial by shock jock? The best changes always do. The best reforms are enduring. And certainly any that I've been involved with as a big player over time, the ones that I'm most proud of are the ones that exist still today. As a junior public servant, I worked on 20 years ago, but they still exist, and I'm still proud of the small part that I played. So I reflect and think real reform is enduring. And enduring change is something to be proud of if you're a public servant. It's really something to be proud of. So I come back to my friend von Clausewitz and the vividness of the transient moment. All along the journey, there are those times when you think, oh gee, this is unpleasant. The media's running against the minister's taking a bath, the office is unhappy, the central agencies, gotta love central agencies, I love them now. The central agencies, spent an entire career avoiding central agencies, it's caught up with me. Central agencies are on my back. You know, they don't think that we're nailing this reform, beam me up. You've got to stay the course. Once you embark on a reform, any reform worth doing requires staying the course. And there's a lot of familiar faces in the room, people who have done some big things, and I'm sure they would all agree that you've got to stay the course. But you've got to start out at the beginning knowing that it's going to be a rough course, knowing that you'll take some body blows both personally and professionally, and that if it's worth doing, you just got to keep going. So those would be my reflections to my young self about, if I could have put a wiser head on younger shoulders. The final thing I would say, though, is that right back at the start I said this can be fun, and one thing I would say about public administration is it can be fun. You really do get to deal with fantastic issues. Your brain gets stretched, you meet brilliant people, you really get to serve. You really feel like you're serving when you meet Australians in the remote outback, or you meet them at Dandenong, or wherever you're practising your public policy. There is the pride and the fun that comes from dealing with real people, the reason we're here. That would be my final reflection, that it can be fun. Thanks a lot.